Nozick's entitlement theory. Nozick's entitlement theory offers us an alternative to the Rawlsian approach, the social contract approach that we discussed previously in the course. So, social contract theories are agreements between individuals for that establish what the principles of justice are for a society. And those principles, as we mentioned, are just distributive principles. So, what rights, duties, obligations do we have, but also what kind of goods people are entitled to, and which ones we might say they aren't entitled to, but might be offered through something like the free market. So, Rawls offers us a pretty extensive sort of theory or approach or process by which we come about these principles, right? That we derive these principles. And Rawls says, well, there are certain things that you're entitled to, that everyone is entitled to, these basic goods or primary goods, because you need those goods to realize your conception of the good life. And so everyone would agree, if we were behind a veil of ignorance, that these are the things that everyone should have access to in our society. Now, Nozick's entitlement theory is much different. Nozick doesn't think that we have those basic that we're entitled to certain basic goods. And what Nozick is offering is what we call a libertarian approach to justice. Now, the libertarian approach is one that places an emphasis on individual liberty and individual freedom. So, libertarian approach is going to be based on this notion that individuals have a right to themselves and a right to the things that come from themselves or their body. So this is what we call a Lockean conception of property. So a Lockean conception of property starts with that assumption that individuals own themselves. And if they own themselves, then they also own their labor. And if they own their labor, then they own what comes from their labor. So to give an example, imagine that I'm walking down the beach and a piece of driftwood floats up in front of me. So I look at this piece of driftwood. It looks unique. I'm thinking to myself, I bet I could make this into something. So I take that driftwood, and that driftwood is previously unowned, so that previously unowned thing. So no one has any legitimate claim to that driftwood. So I take the piece of driftwood, and I take it back to my house, and I go into my shop, and I carve this piece of driftwood, and I mount it, and I create a lamp out of that driftwood. So what have I done? I've taken the previously unknown thing, I've mixed my labor with that thing, and now I've created a piece of property, something new that's now mine. So in a Lockean conception of property, when we mix our labor with some previously unknown thing, that thing becomes ours. Now, it's important to remember in Nozick's theories and in libertarian theories in general, at least what we would call right libertarian theories, once I've mixed my labor with that thing, it becomes my property. That's just how we get property, right? If the world was given to us all in common by God, as Locke held, how then could we have private property, right? Everybody owns everything. Well, Locke says, here's how we get private property. You mix your labor with that thing, and that thing now becomes yours. But once it's yours absolutely. And this is something that Nozick would agree with, that my stuff, the stuff that I've created, is mine. And you can't take it from me. And that also means you can't take it from me without my consent. Which also means that things like taxation has to be completely voluntary. You can't force me to pay taxes because that would be an unjust taking of my stuff, right? If it's my property and I acquired it legitimately, then you can't take it without my consent, without my permission. Now, this basic idea of property, this basic idea of self-ownership, of owning your labor and the mixing of your labor with unknown things to get property is the sort of core of Nozick's entitlement theory. So Nozick has three principles that he thinks governs the transfer of goods in society. So note already how different this is from the sort of Rawlsian approach. Right? Rawls doesn't assume that you own anything absolutely. In fact, he even says at various points, right, that your natural talents and abilities are things that you don't actually deserve. You don't have full claim to because you didn't do anything to get those abilities. For Nozick, all of that is sort of irrelevant. For Nozick, it all boils down to what have you acquired justly and whether or not you've transferred that thing justly. So the distribution in society could be very tilted in one direction or another. In other words, certain people could have a lot, certain people could have very little, and all of that is morally okay, provided that the transfers, the acquisition of the good and the transfer of the good were all legitimate, right? That they were done right in the right way. So how do we know if they've been transferred the right way? Well, Nozick says there are three principles. It says one is the principle of transfer. And Nozick says that a distribution is just if whatever is justly acquired is justly transferred. So this is the principle of transfer. Whatever is justly acquired can be freely transferred to others. So take that driftwood example. If I found the driftwood, mixed my labor, and made it my property, and assuming no one had prior claim to that, then we can say, okay, I've justly acquired that property. That lamp that I've created is now mine. Now, what does that mean? It means that I am free to transfer that lamp to someone else. I can keep the lamp and use it myself. I can sell it to someone. I could destroy the lamp if I wanted to. I could give the lamp away to someone as a gift, or I could sell it to somebody else. Any of those things are perfectly just for me to do. So the principle of transfer says that if I've justly acquired that thing, then I can freely transfer it to others. And remember, nobody can demand of me that lamp, right? Because that's mine. That's my property. So there's the first principle is the principle of transfer. The second principle is the principle of just initial acquisition, right? So an account of how people come to initially own the things that can be transferred in accordance with the first principle. Now, of course, if it turns out that I have something that is previously owned by someone else, then clearly my mixing of labor with something that I didn't justly acquire means I don't have legal claim to that, or I should moral claim to that is a better way to say it. So as long as there's a principle that says, how do I acquire things initially? And for Nozick, it starts with that Lockean principle, right? I'm going to start with the principle of just initial acquisition. What is that principle? He says we should look to John Locke for this. So I come to acquire something justly, initially, and then once I've initially acquired it, I'm free to transfer it. Now, of course, once transfers start taking place, it turns out that as long as the person who transferred something to me, so let's say I look at that lamp and say, that's a really nice lamp, but I've already made 4 or 5 driftwood lamps. I don't need another one. So I've decided to sell it to someone else. So someone comes along and says, I'd like to buy that lamp. And they do. They give me money for the lamp. Then they take that lamp. Well, now their initial acquisition of that lamp is just, assuming that I was just in the way I acquired it. I transferred it to someone else. Now their acquisition of that is just. So they don't necessarily have to mix their labor with something to get an initial acquisition. It might be that someone else has created it first. But either way, they now say, I now own this. I paid for it. It's mine, and it's mine absolutely. And now that it's mine absolutely, I now can choose to do with it what I want. So I can transfer it to someone else. I can destroy it. I can keep it. I can lend it out, whatever. I can gift it. Now, there's a third principle that's needed. So when we talk about how goods should be distributed in our society fairly, Nozick says, well, you have to be able to acquire it fairly, right? The initial acquisition. You have to be able to transfer it. But what happens when someone doesn't acquire it justly? What happens when there isn't a just initial acquisition or a just transfer of goods? Well, he says that we need a third principle, and that's the principle of the rectification of injustice. And that's a principle of how to deal with holdings if they're unjustly acquired or transferred. Now, Nozick doesn't spend a lot of time on this, at least not in the selection that you've read, but he does talk about how do we handle cases where people are attempting to acquire our goods or transfer goods in an unjust way, right, by force or fraud or something like that. So Nozick does talk about this, but we're going to really focus on these first two principles. Those are the important ones for our purposes here. So for Nozick, in a just society, you are going to have a large degree of inequality. Because in this case, the liberty principle, the principle of freedom to transfer and acquire things, is going to take precedent over the principle of equality. If it turns out that I'm just a much better bargainer, or I have more talent such that I can, make things out of driftwood, or, imagine I go and find wild berries that are unowned by anyone else, and it turns out I'm a really good cook, so I take those berries and I make them into jams or jellies, and then I sell those things, and I get a lot more than other people who don't have those skills. That's fine, because I didn't do anything unjust in acquiring the goods. I didn't do anything unjust in mixing my labor with it. That was a legitimate use of my labor. And the transfer was also, I didn't force anybody to buy my jellies and jams or my driftwood lamps or whatever it is I do. So whatever resulting distribution in society, whatever it looks like, in other words, who has what, that's going to be just as long as you appeal to these three principles. Now, this is a very appealing sort of theory, right? Because it's a very simple one. You notice with Rawls, there were all kinds of provisos, and well, we need to look at the original position, and then there's the difference principle, and we have to consider all these other aspects of how we distribute goods, and then we have to take into account natural inequalities as well as social inequalities, and all these things have to be considered. And Nozick says, no, it really just boils down to three principles. How did you get it? How was it transferred? And what to do in a case where those transfers or those acquisitions are unjust. Now, Nozick thinks that his theory of distributive justice is better because it's a historical theory rather than an end result theory or based on end result principles, right? So historical principles say that distributive principles that depend upon how a distribution came about. So what Nozick says is that it's important to ask the question how a distribution came about. You can't just divvy up the goods in society any way you want, because those goods have a history, right? So if I acquired something myself and I did it legitimately, Nozick says you can't just ignore that. You can't just come to me and say, you owe me this, or you have to help others. So a historical principle takes seriously how people got the stuff that they have, right? How a distribution came about. So it takes seriously the question of, did you work hard for this? Were you paid for this? Did you mix your labor with this thing? So if you're a farmer, you went out and you tilled the field and you planted the seeds and you harvested the crop and you pulled the weeds and you did all the things that were necessary to get that food. And if you're an architect, you drew the drawings and you surveyed the site and you put the time in and the hours in, and so you were paid, so that money that you got is yours, right? So he says that you have to take that into account in a theory of justice. On the other hand, he says what Rawls is doing is what he calls a current time slice principle, or an end result principle. And then he says those types of theories, justice of a distribution is determined by how things are distributed based on structural principles. So what he's saying is that the alternative to a historical, to one that takes seriously how goods came about, how you got your stuff, is to just take a point in time and say, we're stopping here and we're going to redistribute goods in a way that's just, based on some sort of structural principles. In Rawls' case, he has his two principles of justice, but Nozick says it doesn't matter sort of what it is. It's some sort of structural principle, but there's an outcome. There's an end result that we want to get to, right? And Nozick says this sort of theory is problematic, right? This sort of theory is problematic because it really doesn't take seriously people's ownership of the things that they have, right? They're willing to sacrifice that for some sort of outcome, for some sort of distribution. But Nozick says, no, justice is messy. Sometimes it doesn't look like that, right? You're not going to get a perfect distribution because people's choices are going to affect those distributions. So what he says is that an entitlement theory like his results in a non-pattern distribution. And all that means is that when you look at the result, there isn't going to be a clear pattern or distribution or, sort of curve out there. It's going to look kind of messy. So if it turns out I'm, really ambitious and work really hard, I'm probably going to get more in a society than someone who doesn't work as hard. And it might turn out that, certain people start with less natural abilities or endowments, and that means that some of those people who aren't as talented aren't going to get as much. But there's nothing unjust about that, because there's nothing unjust about the initial acquisition, right, of those things. So I might say, look, if I happen to be born with certain talents for something like playing basketball, if I'm born with natural height and maybe good hand-eye coordination and perfect vision and all these other things, the question might be, well, yeah, you know what? I'm going to have a lot more if I can sort of turn those in. I can develop those talents into a lot more money to play professional basketball. And you might say, but, in that case, you're going to have a lot more than others. I say, yeah. And they say, well, but you don't deserve those talents. And no, it's true, I don't, maybe. But it's also true I did nothing unjust to get them. So it's not like I took talent from someone else, or that somehow my DNA was messed with, when I was in utero and they fixed me and made me into something. So, I had an unfair advantage. It turns out, no, those were completely random. So since I didn't do anything unjust to acquire my talents, the initial acquisition, right, then whatever follows from those talents is perfectly justified. So there are some people who are more talented and they're going to have more, and Nozick is fine with that. So what he's saying is that there's a difference between ambition and endowment. So unlike Rawls's theory, Nozick's theory is not endowment sensitive, but it is ambition sensitive. So what that means is when you look at someone like John Rawls, Rawls says, look, there are two types of inequality, right? As I've already mentioned, there's natural inequality and there's social inequality. Rawls says both of these things lead to differences in distribution and differences of justice, right? So you can socially disadvantage me. You can discriminate based on sex or sexual orientation or something like that, or race. Those things are all social inequalities, and Rawls says we got to get rid of those. On the other hand, though, Rawls also says, but there are certain endowments that people have that give some people massive advantages over others, and those lead to inequalities. And for Rawls, that's a problem. For Nozick, Nozick's system isn't endowment sensitive. He doesn't care whether some people are more talented or less talented than others because they didn't do anything unjust in acquiring their talent. It's just bad luck. So if you happen to be born with no talents, or you happen to be born, severely disabled in some way, that's unfortunate. So Nozick might say, well, it sucks to be you, but nobody did that to you, right? There's no injustice. But his theory is ambition sensitive. So he says, if you do develop your talents, and if you do acquire things based on your talent, and you transfer those things justly, so if I'm a really good basketball player and, I'm scouted and the Cavs come to me and say, we're going to offer you 30, 60, $80 million to play for us. And somebody else who really likes basketball and plays all the time but doesn't have the talent, doesn't get any money, or is never scouted. There's nothing unjust about that. It turns out I had certain talents and I developed those talents. So there's where the ambition comes in, right? I've developed my talents. So I'm owed that money, or not owed that money, but it's fine that I get that. And remember, once I get my 60, 80, whatever the going rate is, I own that absolutely. No one can lay claim to that. That money is mine. And the only thing in terms of transfers that can be done is if I voluntarily transfer that to others. So note that when we talk about these things, we have no natural obligations to others on this. So if there's someone who's, imagine I have a situation where it's a two-person world, and you say, okay, well, here's these wild apples that are growing, and I can go and pick an apple and eat it because I have no impairments of any sort. But imagine there's somebody who's born who actually can't walk or, grab those apples themselves. And unless I go up and grab an apple and hand it to them, they're going to die. On Nozick's theory, if I didn't cause their inability to pick those apples, then I'm under no obligation to actually give them apples, to go up and pick an apple and give it to them. I'm under no obligation to give my own apple to them, because we don't have any obligations to others unless we voluntarily take on those, right? So we can form agreements and contracts with others that say we have obligations, but I don't have any natural obligation. So another example, you imagine I'm sitting at a dinner at a friend's house. They've invited me over and there's tons of food, more food than we can eat. In fact, probably be leftovers. They'll say, take some home. Imagine there's a little knock at the door. And here comes a child, this little child, 4-year-old, standing there starving and dressed in rags, saying, could you please give me some food? I'm starving. Now, if I were to go over and grab a piece of bread off the table of my friend's house and hand it to them, my friend could legitimately on Nozick's account say, no, you can't do that. That's not yours. That's my property. I've allowed you to eat it. We have an agreement. I've invited you for dinner, but you can't give it to that person. If they chose to send the little child away, they would be doing nothing morally wrong. All right, so on their account, that child would have no legitimate claim, even if there was more food then I could eat. Even if that child would literally starve to death on this account, there is no obligation. So an entitlement theory is ambition sensitive for those who have more because of talents, abilities, or just simply good luck. That's fine. Now, of course, if the other person is suffering because of something I've done, then that's where that third principle comes into play, right? What to do when there's an unjust transfer of goods. So if I've done something to cause their starving, then of course I'm obligated to help, right? I would now have to obligate to somehow compensate them for whatever that was. So on this account then, unlike a Rawlsian state, right, the sort of society that we're setting up with Rawls, only the minimalist state is morally justifiable, right? So for Nozick, the only kind of state we could have, and he sort of hedges here a little bit. He says, well, we might have to have some kind of minimal system of taxation or, buy-in for the enforcement of contracts and protections against force and fraud. And generally, he thinks these would be voluntary associations where people would pay. And he kind of hedges a little bit. He thinks maybe you might be able to sort of justify a little bit of requirement, that, look, you have to pay a certain amount. It couldn't be completely voluntary. It would have to be based on what is necessary to pay people to be able to do this work. But he thinks those things might be sort of justified. But he really thinks most of those things would start as completely voluntary agreements where you would negotiate with a sort of minimalist state. So the state really is only there to enforce contracts and protects against force and fraud, sort of the minimalist police state, right? The policing value of the state. But anything else, any other, distributions would all be voluntary distributions. So if you want to have something like a social service, it would be people would get together voluntarily and pay for a park, or they would contribute to a charity that would distribute to others. But nothing could be compelled. So there wouldn't be no such thing as welfare. There wouldn't be, obviously there wouldn't be anything like public libraries, right? If you want books, go buy books. If you want to start a library, a private library, that's fine, where a bunch of people chip in to buy a whole bunch of books that everyone can borrow from each other, so each individual doesn't have to buy. But a public library where you tax people without their consent, so you can imagine there's a library levy and some people don't for the levy. On Nozick's account, the people who, even if the majority says, yes, we should all pay for this library, on Nozick's account, it would be unjust to compel me to take some of my goods that I've justly acquired and give it, in this case, my money, to give it to a public library. So a minimalist state really does mean minimal. There's no such thing as public education. There's no public universities. Everything would be privatized. All education would be privatized. All health is privatized. If you want something like unemployment, then you'd buy unemployment insurance, right? That would be sort of the result. There's no such thing as sort of a state welfare system. So this is, in this sense, then, this is what we mean by it being endowment sensitive, right? If you're ambitious and you work and you acquire things, then those things are yours, and that means some people are just going to have more than others. Now, Nozick just doesn't state this. He says, look, there's a couple of arguments I can give, right? There's this sort of intuitive argument I can give for the entitlement theory. So he says, look, let's say you look at this and say, no, this seems wrong to me, that that distribution shouldn't be this unequal, that we shouldn't have vast inequalities in our society. So he says, look, pick some initial distribution of goods by some rule. Right, so remember, his rule one is the Lockean sort of rule for the initial distribution. But he says, okay, but even if you don't agree with that one, let's say you say, okay, let's take everything in our society and distribute it equally. So our initial distribution will be a complete equal distribution to all people. Now he says that initial distribution to everyone, provided by some rule. So for example, this rule might be distribute everything equally. Now he says, look, there's going to be a second distribution that's going to result from D1 according to certain principles P, in this case, his principles, his entitlement principles. And he says, look, their people are going to have their stuff, but then they're going to start exchanging stuff with each other. And so if the initial distribution is just, everyone got an equal share, and then everyone distributed these things according to his principles, right? So I can't force you to give me something. These are all voluntary exchanges. There's no force or fraud or deception. Then a second distributive state is going to is going to result. And what he says is, if D1 is just, that equal distribution is just, and the exchanges of goods that result in D2 is not forced, right? So the next distribution, then D2 itself is also just. And he says, look, how can you object to this? If everybody gets a fair amount of goods, and those goods are exchanged justly without any force, then whatever the resulting distribution looks like, itself is going to be just. So it might be that people make very bad decisions. People squander their money on certain things. They say, well, you could have invested your money. You could have put your money in a bank for interest, made an agreement with others to give them your money and then get interest on that. You could have invested in stocks. You could have, started a business. So you say, well, I get this lump sum of money and resources, and so I decided to start a small, a small vegetable stand or something, and I grew some corn. I invested in that, and now each fall or late summer and fall, I sell corn, and I made 3 times as much as I invested. All those are good decisions I could have made, but others are going to squander it, right? They're going to buy stuff that they like. They're going to buy, maybe they're going to go out and party a lot and whatever. And Nozick's going to say, look, even if there's an exchange that is much, much different than equality, that distribution, whatever it looks like, is still going to be okay, right? There's nothing morally wrong. How could it be? There was a just input into just principles, fair principles, that resulted in a just output. So that's his intuitive argument. But he also gives another example. He calls the Wilt Chamberlain example. For those, Wilt Chamberlain was a basketball player, and of course, Nozick wrote his book actually came out around 1973. So the numbers here might seem a little small for what we would consider now, but imagine the following scenario. Wilt Chamberlain, this great basketball player, negotiates a contract such that people have to place an extra 25 cents in a separate box in order to watch him play. So in addition to whatever he's making, he's so good and he's such an attraction that in order for him to play, you walk in, you bought your ticket, but if you want him to actually play, you have to give another 25 cents. So throughout the season, Wilt Chamberlain collects his 25 cents extra, and at the end of the year, Wilt Chamberlain receives $250,000 more than any other player in the league. Now, granted, $250,000 these days isn't a whole lot, but imagine it was $10 million more than every player. So $250,000 adjusted for inflation in 1973. Figure out what that is. That's what Wilt Chamberlain gets, and it's substantially more than other players. Because remember, Wilt's still getting his money to play, but he also gets this 25 cents extra that just goes to him because he's just that good, right? Now, the question is, does Chamberlain deserve that money? And according to Nozick, of course he does, because that money was voluntarily given, right? So assuming that the people who have the money got that money legitimately, and assuming they voluntarily put it in the box to see him play, right? They didn't have to go see Wilt Chamberlain play. They didn't have to buy a ticket. They could say, look, if he's not going to play for the regular price of admission, I'm not going. But they didn't do that. They bought the ticket. They put the 25 cents in. Wilt Chamberlain played. That was the agreement. Then he deserves the money. Now, the real question is, what's the problem with Nozick's entitlement theory? So you can see there's an intuitive appeal here, right? If I have something and it's mine, people shouldn't be able to come along and force me to give it to other people. So what's the argument here? Well, I think one of the probably biggest arguments against this is the question of initial ownership. So Nozick says, remember, so let's go back a minute. Nozick says if the initial acquisition is just, then the transfer is just. But imagine a situation where I've stolen something. So let's say I've stolen some good. You don't know that it's stolen, but I now transfer that stolen good to you. Well, clearly, that transfer isn't a just transfer, right? So even if you have that thing that I've stolen, so imagine you didn't know, obviously, that I stole the thing, but imagine I've transferred that thing to you, and you've now taken that thing and made more money based on it, then any of those gains that you got from the stolen good, even if you didn't know it was stolen, is still an unjust transfer, right? So let's take a very easy example. We live in Ohio, and Ohio isn't exactly, near the Cuyahoga River. Ohio isn't exactly an English name. This is from Native Americans that were here. So if I came in to land that they had worked, and there were Native Americans who were farming the land, so they'd mixed their labor, technically it was their land. If my ancestors or your ancestors or those who were here, my ancestors didn't come here until the late 1800s, but if that land was initially acquired unjustly, so if they forced them off the land, and then that land was transferred to someone else who then built a factory on that land or farmed that land, made a big farm, and then, got the profits from that farm, then those transfers, that initial acquisition of the land, means those who got the land and farmed it means that they don't deserve the benefits of that. And if that land was sold eventually to someone who put a factory up, then the factory is based on land that was stolen from someone else. And the factory itself, whatever came from that, isn't justly acquired. So you can see what happens here. There's this sort of domino effect of unjust transfers, which means that those of us now who are living here on this land and benefiting from it also don't deserve the things that come from this. So you could be sitting at a university that was on land that was actually based on force and fraud way, way back, several hundred years ago. And therefore, if you benefit from the university being placed on this land and being able to teach you, which means you get a college degree, which that degree then translates into more money, you actually don't deserve the money. Now, what does Nozick say about this? He says, "Whoa, and this is there's a phrase: the history of the world is the history of oppression." So if we really look back at who's oppressed who over time, it seems like there's an endless chain of oppression, where various people have been oppressing and taking from others. So this poses a real problem, right? Well, Nozick has an answer. Nozick basically says, let's forget about all of that stuff in the past, and let's just start fresh. Now you can see already where that's a problem, because if you're just simply starting fresh, then you're essentially doing what Rawls just said. In fact, Nozick in his book says maybe we should start with some sort of acquisition like Rawls, some sort of initial distribution like Rawls has. And then we'll go on from there. And then we'll all transactions after a sort of Rawlsian starting point will be based on his principles. So there's a little bit of hedging with Nozick. So the question is whether one problem with Nozick is clearly how do we account for all the oppression? I mean, even in today, we know that slavery in the South, that the cotton and other natural resources then went north to fuel the factories, and those factories then profited from indirectly or in some senses directly from slavery. So we know that even in our own country, we're grappling with this. And then you can talk about things like unjust laws historically that have disenfranchised some, which allowed others to obtain land or loans or mortgages. So you've got all kinds of things in law of blockbusting and redlining and things that have resulted in a disproportionate transfer of wealth, generational wealth. So Nozick's theory has a hard time handling this, and he seems to hedge and just say, well, at some point we're just going to have to stop and not worry about the fact that some of this was acquired unjustly. That's a problem, right? That's going to be a problem for this theory. The other problem is, or another problem I should say, is the problem of something as simple as, do we have moral obligations to others? So even if it's the case that there are things that I've acquired justly, does that mean that I have no natural obligations to other human beings, right? Is there anyone who isn't in fact dependent on others or the generosity of others? So is it really realistic to say that, look, if somebody is really suffering, that taking that slice of bread off my table to feed someone who's hungry, if someone comes, friend grabs that piece of bread of mine and hands it to the starving kid, have they really done something morally wrong? Now, you might argue there's legal, they stole from me legally, but even that is sort of questionable, right? You might say, well, look, a law that doesn't allow someone who has way more than they actually need doesn't allow someone to give that or take that to redistribute to others seems to be problematic. Right. So there's at least two major problems with this, right? We can talk about these natural obligations to others. There's also a third, that if you receive the benefits of society, don't you have an obligation to pay some of that back? So it might be that everyone acts in these sort of self-interested contractual ways, but it also turns out that a lot of people do benefit from what others do. So if I fix up my yard and my house, my neighbors around me who've done nothing to contribute to that get a benefit just by me being a good neighbor and cleaning up my yard, making sure my house looks nice. So it seems that there's an interdependence that the libertarian theory wants to ignore that we have. But again, it is one theory. It's one that you will most likely encounter um, out there in the real world, where people say, "Look, there are libertarians today who say that every single thing should be privatized, and I have no obligations other than those that I voluntarily take on." And notice, we're sitting at a university that's publicly funded by people who don't have kids in school. So if you really think that no, we shouldn't be supporting this, I have no obligations to do this, then you'd have to ask yourself, well, am I willing to pay the true cost of my education? Because the state subsidizes every student. So libertarianism is conceptually or theoretically very nice. It's very compact. You can predict exactly what a libertarian will say about various issues, because at least the right libertarian, there are left libertarians that are slightly different, but we'll sort of put that aside for now. But a right libertarian, it is a very compact, very elegant sort of system, but it also has consequences that we're not always sure that we necessarily want to live with, right? We say, well, I don't know if we can live with the principle that says I don't have any sort of obligation to anyone else, or there's no such thing as a social good that I can be compelled to contribute to. So that would be the sort of objections to this sort of view. All right, with that, if you have questions, please feel free to contact me. And this is also, I think, an interesting area if you're interested in this, to go on to taking a course in social and political philosophy, where these sort of issues and these various theories are looked at in more detail.